There's a ton of noise out there. So how do you get decision makers to pay attention to your brand? Start a podcast and invite your ideal clients to be guests on your show. Learn more at sweetfishmedia.com.
You're listening to B2B Growth, a daily podcast for B2B leaders. We've interviewed names you've probably heard before, like Gary Vaynerchuk and Simon Sinek, but you've probably never heard from the majority of our guests. That's because the bulk of our interviews aren't with professional speakers and authors. Most of our guests are in the trenches leading sales and marketing teams. They're implementing strategy. They're experimenting with tactics. They're building the fastest growing B2B companies in the world. My name is James Carberry. I'm the founder of Sweetfish Media, a podcast agency for B2B brands, and I'm also one of the co-hosts of this show. When we're not interviewing sales and marketing leaders, you'll hear stories from behind the scenes of our own business. We'll share the ups and downs of our journey as we attempt to take over the world. Just kidding. Well, maybe. Let's get into the show. Welcome back to another episode of B2B Growth. This is a little bit different. We are not interviewing an external VP of marketing or CEO today. Instead, it is Logan and I talking through a topic that we've been thinking about a lot lately. So Logan actually posted something on LinkedIn yesterday about the importance of understanding your sales methodology before you can start diving into sales tech and adding things to your tech stack. You need to have a really good understanding of what your sales methodology is. Logan, do you want to dive in and kind of elaborate on your post from yesterday?
Yeah. So I think, James, you hit the nail on the head. It's really easy to get focused on, especially if you're in a new role or you're growing a sales team, what's our tech stack going to be so we can be most efficient? But, you and I have been talking a lot about, efficiency versus effectiveness. And I think you need to get nailed down your methodology so that you can make sure you're being efficient in the right way so that you can be effective in where you're really trying to go. And so, we've talked a lot about what our methodology is at Sweetfish in our sales methodology in starting with relationships. I've been in other roles where basically the methodology was, go out and sell stuff, start conversations somehow. So basically really no methodology. I've been, in other roles where it wasn't so much leading with a relationship as the value, maybe leading with an analysis and insight as the value, where maybe you're selling some technology and you have a process, by which you help the customer free of charge, do some analysis that uncovers what's their current state, where are some gaps that you might be able to help with, and then that turns into the sales conversation. So, whether it's analysis, relationships, however you're kind of starting the conversation and where you want it to go, I think that's important to nail down and really think about before you start investing in sales tech or thinking about, what is the process that supports that higher level methodology.
Yeah. When I read your post yesterday, Logan, if I'm honest, I thought, man, this sounds really good. But I was like, man, what is our sales methodology? And as we were talking about it offline, as soon as you said it, you were like, well, our sales methodology is, rooted in our values, like relationships. We ask people to be a guest on our show. And so I obviously knew that. I just didn't necessarily know, the terminology, sales methodology. I don't have a sales background. And so hearing that term, I was like, okay, what's that really mean? And so establishing our sales methodology without even really knowing that that's what it was called, being right. in relationships is one way to do it. The way that we create those relationships is through content collaborations. So I'm either, asking to feature people on our podcast. I'm asking them to be featured in a column that I write for back a while back. It was Huffington Post. Now it's Entrepreneur. And so I've figured out ways to collaborate with our prospects to create content with them. But then we also have, other types of leads that are coming into the business. So because of you and I's activity on LinkedIn, we're getting an enormous amount of inbound coming in either through referral or people just reaching out to us directly. We've got a Fortune 500 company right now that's in our pipeline that we're working with that came directly through LinkedIn. And so can you speak to kind of how does our sales methodology translate to those leads that are coming in, not necessarily from people that we're doing those content collaborations with, but they're coming inbound?
Yeah. So, in the weeks leading up to me coming on and over the last week or so, you and I have, started to talk a lot about, sales process. And, I'm very much, kind of try to think about things analytically. And so those were a lot of my, first questions in coming on board is, what's our process? How do we, go from interest, whether that's, a relationship with a podcast interview or content collaboration or an inbound lead. And so, really what we've been talking through and working on and thinking about a lot lately is the process that comes out of that methodology once we've got a relationship. And, we've talked about what's our sequence of calls. How do we lead customers through the buying process once we're engaged in a sales conversation? And one of the things we've talked about is instead of combining a sales call into discovery, qualifying, and presentation of our pricing and our proposal, it kind of splitting those up into a conversation that's really focused on qualifying and understanding, the customer situation, talking a little bit about whether our value proposition fits in with where they want to go. But I think where we bring in the relationship part of our methodology back into this process, the way that we're separating it into two calls now where we can, is talking through in that second call how our customers might brand their podcast that we might launch for them. What that might look like. What would the show maybe be titled? And to me, that goes back to we're building a relationship because we're having a second conversation. We're not just saying, hey, here's what it costs to produce a podcast. Do you want to or not? We're investing a little bit more time in collaborating with them on the potential of their podcast. And that does two things. It deepens the relationship, but it also shows that we're invested and helps them visualize the future. So for us, if they're visualizing themselves, having a podcast instead of looking at what does it cost me to produce a podcast? Do I want to do this or not? Then they're much more likely to take action. But at the same time, we're deepening that relationship because we're collaborating together on a project rather than saying, here's our podcast service. Here's your business. Do they fit?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That was one of the first suggestions that you made even before you officially started. We were pretty early in the process after we had figured out, kind of the details, and we had, you were for sure coming on board at that point, and you had suggested after asking what our current sales process looked like. And I had said, well, it's typically a one call close. We do one sales call, and if they want it, they buy it. And if they don't, we kind of move on. And you suggested adding a second call. And as soon as you made that suggestion, I instantly knew that felt right. I've known by doing as many podcast interviews as we've done that the podcast interview is great. It's a great first step to building a relationship. But if all I do is have one interaction with you, there's not very much depth in our relationship at all. So I've known for a while that even on the podcast side of it, like the content collaboration side, if it stops there, then the likelihood of it materializing into something, isn't nearly as high. And so insert, these B2B growth dinners that we've been doing. So now, I'm getting on a plane tomorrow to go to New York City, and I'm going and meeting up with several of the guests that we've had on our podcast in the last couple of years. I'm now adding a second kind of stage to my friendship with those people. And through that genuine relationship, there's probably going to, there's going to be some opportunities thrown my way, either from the guests themselves saying, hey, we want to do a podcast with you, or referring us to folks that they know, like, hey, this person's been talking about it. You should really connect with them. I think they'd be a great client for you guys. So things are going to happen, but those things that are happening just in a lot of cases aren't going to happen after one interaction or one conversation. And so I love that you're applying what I've been trying to apply to B2B growth with our podcast guests. And you just said, man, like, let's apply that to folks that are coming inbound, folks that even that we go outbound with. We do a mix of inbound and outbound. And so I knew instantly it was the right direction, and it made so much sense to me without me even really knowing what sales methodology meant, because it aligns with that core value of relationships are our oxygen. And,
right.
And so by you saying, hey, let's have this first call be to really understand their business, understand who their ideal buyers are, so that we can then come back to them in a second call and say, hey, here's what we think a show for you could look like. Instead of what I was doing before, I was just kind of coming up with, what a potential show name could be, like, on the fly after I did some digging, find out who their buyer is. And I really, if I'm honest, I wasn't even that proactive and intentional about finding out that information. I found myself in a lot of cases just kind of explaining the nuts and bolts of our service, and that was it. And then I thought, well, if they want it, they want it. If they don't, they don't. But with this process, where you're being much more intentional on that first call to do that true discovery work of finding out about their business, who their most profitable buyer is, and then giving yourself time to say, and if they want pricing, we've talked through that. We're willing to give them pricing on that first call because it's a productized service, and we've got a pretty standard offering that, we can tweak, but we've designed it the way we have for a reason because we know it's super effective. Right. And so, sharing the pricing there, but really saying, hey, let's set up another call with maybe another stakeholder on your team, the CEO or somebody else from your team that maybe the person that you think is going to host the show. And let's get some buy-in from other people on their team while simultaneously deepening the relationship with that first person that you talk to and adding real tangible value by saying, hey, based on our last call, you said that your buyer is a, operations leader in this particular industry. Let's do a podcast focused on that specific industry. And here's some iTunes copy could look like. Maybe here's what a logo could look like for the show. Like doing a couple really cool things that I think would add enormous value, deepen the relationship, and push the conversation along in a meaningful way. And so apart from you coming in and saying that, we wouldn't have made those process adjustments, but it was really you tapping into our own sales methodology and figuring out, okay, how do we extrapolate the core elements of that methodology and bake it into the sales process so that it's more aligned with what we truly believe, which is, the importance of relationships.
Right. Yeah. And for me, that has always been just a part of my process. I've sold customized software. I've sold technology where, I couldn't provide a price right on the spot, maybe some sort of ballpark, but it usually involved, one or two kind of qualification information gathering before I could present something. So, it kind of honestly came out of, just the way that I've approached things. And so, when I stepped in to this role, that was just kind of part of my idea. But you bring up a good point. We have a productized service. We don't want to come across as kind of hiding our pricing, and two, there's really not too much reason to not talk about that in the first call. And so I've had to think through, this moving from qualification to presenting, what ways does that make sense for our business? And I love that we're working through and finding a way that works, and that it aligns with that value of building relationships, and it allows us to do more storytelling. This, this is what your podcast could look like. These are the people you could be interviewing, because, whether you're in sales or marketing, that, facts tell and stories sell. And the more that we can weave storytelling, which you're so good at with your messaging, into our sales process as well, I think that's going to be a good thing. And many of our listeners can weave that in their own way. It won't look exactly like ours, but if you think about, taking your overall methodology and your values, how does that affect the process that you're putting in place in your sequence in your buyer's journey, and then, look at and kind of iterate on that process and see what's working and what's not, then you'll be on the right track.
I love it. Logan, this has been fantastic, man. I appreciate you jumping on and talking through this. I loved your post from yesterday, and really, really appreciate you in contributing what you've already contributed in the week and a half that you've been on the team. It's just stoked to do a lot more of these. If you're listening to this and you did not hear our episode from, I think it was 2 Fridays ago, Logan is our very first sales hire. And so he officially started July 2nd, and he is joining the team as a co-host of B2B Growth and obviously running sales for our business as well. So you're going to be hearing Logan and I talk a lot more. My solo episodes on the weekends, I might still be doing true solo episodes with just me, but a lot of those will likely be with Logan now as well, talking through different elements of our business as we're kind of uncovering what we're learning, how we're growing, because I've gotten some tremendous feedback so far from listeners that they really like kind of the behind the scenes, peeling the curtain back in our own business and sharing what's working for us and how we're learning and growing. So if you're listening to this and this is the first time you're hearing me talk to a stranger named Logan, know that he won't be a stranger for long if you plan on listening to the show, because he's going to be a regular fixture here. So again, Logan, you're the man, and we will talk very soon.
Awesome. Enjoyed the chat as always, James.
There are lots of ways to build a community, and we've chosen to build the B2B Growth community through this podcast. But because of the way podcasts work, it's really hard to engage with our listeners. And without engagement, it's tough to build a great community. So here's what we've decided to do. We're organizing small dinners across the country with our listeners and guests. No sales pitches, no agenda, just great conversations with like-minded people. We'll talk business, we'll talk family, we'll talk goals and dreams. We'll build friendships. So if you'd like to be a part of a B2B Growth dinner in a city near you, go to b2bgrowthdinners.com. That's b2bgrowthdinners.com. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.